in 100 years, because one hopes it will not last that long. Anyway, this of course is coming on the heels of roughly 20 Shahed-style or Shahed decoy drones entering Poland earlier this week. They all came from Russia, and while NATO has not yet publicly declared whether it was intentional or an accident, simultaneously, NATO does not care. Either way, Russian drones pose an unacceptable threat to the alliance. Now, I do not know about you, but I saw a ton of online commentary about how NATO's initial response was soft. So I think it is worth diving into the public details of Eastern Sentry released thus far, and we should also put the plan in the context of what else NATO has been doing recently. Let me start by discussing what is happening, and I mean is happening, because Eastern Sentry started earlier on Friday, even before the press conference that you are watching right now where they announced it. I hope you like blue backgrounds, because I am going to be sticking with this B-roll for a while. That is NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on the right. On the left is Supreme Allied Commander Europe Alex Grinkwich, whose call sign earlier in his life was Grinch. That is not especially pertinent to our story for today, but I just think is cool, and we will come back to him later. The basic idea of Eastern Sentry is to shift even more assets to NATO's eastern flank. I say even more, because there were already a couple of phases of this, first in 2014 after Russia's annexation of Crimea, and again in 2022 when Putin announced the special military operation. At minimum, Denmark, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom are kinetically participating, in addition to the countries physically on the eastern flank. I do not think that we should treat those countries as a complete list, though, because the project began only 2 days removed from the drone encounter. I also want to highlight that kinetic qualifier, because we will see in a moment that the broader alliance will be put to work here. Yes, that even means this guy's country. Although NATO seems satisfied with the multilateral response to the incursion, one of the places for improvement is not to have a country-by-country response, but rather have an integrated approach. That requires a new command structure, which is how you end up with a new project like Eastern Sentry. Some new materiel has already been made available. French Rafale fighters, Danish F-16s, a frigate, and some ground-based air defenses. Again, probably best to think of that collection of goods as the starting point after 48 hours, and not the end point. The other half of it is liable to get lost in the shuffle, because this starts to veer into the finer points of NATO bureaucracy. At the press conference, NATO also announced that Allied Command Transformation, based out of Norfolk, Virginia, will work on new solutions to the problem. And missing this part is a big problem. Some of the early criticism regarding Eastern Sentry is a lack of clarity regarding what exactly it is. Well, more materiel and a better integrated command structure are both important. But if there is a lack of further clarity, it is because, in part, NATO likely does not yet have a great long-term solution, short of bombing every launch site inside of Russia. If we restrict ourselves to non-escalatory measures, NATO only has expensive medium-term solutions, which require the use of Patriots and interceptor fighters. Now, there is a fair criticism to be made that, 3 years into the war, NATO still has no good long-term solution. But finding such a solution is why Allied Command Transformation exists, and, as of this week, they are on the case. Let's rewind for a second. One of the central concerns about how to defend Western territory from Russian drones is the cost ratio. Drones are cheap for Russia to produce, and the technology that NATO uses to counter those drones is much more expensive. Ukraine, by comparison, is way better at finding cost-effective solutions. However, Kyiv still struggles with the extent of the problem and its own resource limitations, hence the regular Russian drone attacks causing significant damage. Well, NATO faced a similar problem with the Baltic Sea earlier this year. Russian assets accidentally on purpose dragged anchors to cut seafloor cables. Baltic Sentry was NATO's program to counter those efforts. It worked well, and thus at the press conference, they frequently compared Eastern Sentry to it. Part of what Allied Command Transformation did in response to the Baltic threat was to develop cost-effective solutions. It is a difficult challenge having to patrol such a large body of water, and needing to deter Russian sabotage along every part of it. I actually went to Norfolk not too long ago to learn specifically about what was happening there, and even more specifically the work of Task Force X Baltic. It is a great story, and I hope one day to be able to tell it. But because 2 days cannot pass without something in the world completely breaking down, I suspect that I will finally be able to release said video in, say, October 2037. My frustration aside, the main point here is that Allied Command Transformation may be responsible for the long-term solution. In the meantime, NATO can brute force the solution by simply putting more assets in the east, putting them on heightened alert, and unlocking a freer command structure to engage when problems arise. Moving along, there are still a bunch of tangents to tie down as it relates to the response. First is the relative speed of the operation. Contrary to a common narrative among internet skeptics, this all unfolded fairly fast as far as military and political responses go. The immediate response was, in fact, immediate. There were no deliberations before countering the direct threats as those drones were coming in. The idea that this would, say, 5 hours later, result in some sort of long-term defensive operation or offensive retaliation is rather crazy. Russia does not have the resources at the moment to pose an imminent danger to Poland or any other part of the NATO eastern flank. As a result, the Allies have the luxury of time to come up with an interim solution and then a long-run solution afterward. There is no need to rush into something that poses unnecessary escalation risks with Russia. Indeed, this is exactly why Article 4 exists. It is a mechanism to get everyone's affairs together when the danger is on the order of weeks to months, rather than hours or days. Save Article 5 for the actual emergencies. And even with Article 4 being the appropriate step, the first part of the interim solution is already being put into place, just 2 days after the drone incursion happened. Perhaps some historical perspective is in order here. September 11th happened on... September 11th. The United States did not invade Afghanistan until October 7th. The delay was not because the United States was unsure of whom to target. It was because waiting did not put the United States further at risk, and putting together a good plan is better than going with the first idea that occurs to you. Moving on to our second loose end, notably absent from the conversation thus far are the explicit words, United States. This came up in the Q&A portion of the press conference, when there was a suggestion that the United States had been absent from the defenses scrambled over Poland. Grinch, perhaps staying true to his call sign, appeared maybe slightly irritated that he had to point out that he was coordinating the response as a US general and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He further noted that the absence of US kinetic forces to the immediate response was a function of standard rotations. In other words, if this were to happen again, the United States might be a part of the response, depending on the particular day. It is also not a good idea to read into Trump's lack of follow-up to his vague Truth Social post, declaring his displeasure with Russia's actions. The US media has been devoted 24/7 to Charlie Kirk since the afternoon following the drone incursion, to the point that I suspect that most of my American viewers have not heard a word about Eastern Sentry from traditional news media. Another thing that has evaded broader public attention for the same reason is the US discussion with the European Union to increase joint sanctions against Russia and its coalition partners. Those discussions stalled not because of US unwillingness, but because of EU unwillingness to eat the costs of those sanctions. But back to Grinch. What he did not say, but probably is worth pointing out, is that overinterpreting the US role here is not good for alliance cohesion. There are plenty of valid criticisms about US behavior toward NATO as of late, but highlighting invalid criticisms is exactly the type of thing that a Russian disinformation campaign would love to do. Third, there has been some conversation that Russia's underlying plan here is to sidetrack NATO. In other words, make NATO think more about intra-alliance security and less about sending assistance to Ukraine. This seems like a reasonable concern, and I could further see how someone might look at Eastern Sentry and think that NATO has fallen into the trap. But a few points of rebuttal. 1. Assets like those F-16s were not headed to Ukraine under any circumstance. That part of the Sentry program is merely an internal transfer and nothing more. 2. If NATO ever does decide to intervene by, say, shutting down the skies over western Ukraine, they would have to do it as part of a coordinated effort. It cannot be that Italy takes Tuesday mornings, Germany gets Thursday nights, Poland covers the weekends, and so forth. In that regard, drone incursions have induced NATO to pre-solve the coordination problem. As I said a minute ago, I think a reasonable criticism can be made here that it should not have taken more than 3 years in the war for this to happen, but better now than 6 years into the war. 3. Heading back to Norfolk. Whatever solutions that Allied command transformation is going to work on will be general solutions. This will not be a fix to solving drone defenses over the country of Poland. It will be a fix to solving drone defenses over countries broadly speaking. So Ukraine will benefit because NATO can simply transfer the new technology over to Ukraine. 4. Fair point about the land-based air defenses heading to the eastern flank. In the short run, those are air defense systems that could have gone to Ukraine instead. However, the alliance's central problem remains a lack of defense manufacturing. If there were spare factories abound, Western countries could simply flip a switch and have all of the metal that anyone could ask for. Insofar as the Poland incursion serves as a wake-up call, there will be more political support for investment in manufacturing. Thus, in the long run, there is still the opportunity for more defenses for Ukraine. And my final loose end connects to this concern. The announced Eastern Sentry only covers NATO's eastern flank. It does not cover Ukraine. That piece of news certainly disappoints anyone pulling for Ukraine, and who had hoped that the Poland incursion would induce NATO to take an active role in the war. Well, I hinted at this in my video on the morning after the incursion, but such actions are unlikely to happen under a NATO banner. That is in part because you need consensus among the 32 allies to do something like this. But it is also in part because keeping NATO in arm's length from the war is important to limit Russia's domestic propaganda. Remember, Russia is currently fighting the war using voluntary forces, recruited via market wages. That is why Russian troops can only advance at a snail's pace. There simply are not enough men on the front lines to push faster. One way that this could all break down is if the Kremlin convinces the Russian public that this is truly a war between NATO and Russia, and that the Russian people are under the threat of a big, evil Western monster. The Kremlin has tried to insert that narrative already into the war, seemingly nonstop. It has not worked because NATO is not actually there, and the Kremlin has limits on how much it can misinform the Russian public. Not for lack of trying, but because enough Russians can still access external media. But once NATO forces are actively involved in Western Ukraine, the Kremlin no longer needs propaganda to shape the narrative. It is just a fact that NATO is engaging Russian military assets in Ukraine. Now, your average Russian citizen may still look at that with apathy, leaving the Kremlin to continue recruiting in the manner that it has been for close to 3 years. On the other hand, it might work, and that is a problem that neither NATO nor Ukraine wants to deal with. However, nothing about Eastern Sentry will prevent individual countries from taking individual actions, or with a coalition of the willing, and that will come without political baggage in the shape of a NATO flag. One headline that went under the radar because of all of the Russian drones popping up on Polish radars the same day is that the United Kingdom will fund thousands of long-range attack drones for Ukraine to aim at Russia. Well, those things can hit the Russian drone facilities that are producing all of these problems for Poland and the rest of NATO, and they do not come with the same escalation concerns of NATO directly attacking Russia. To be clear, the UK plan was in the works before the whole Poland incursion, but the Poland incursion might inspire more countries to join in on that effort or something similar, and nothing about Eastern Sentry interferes with those alternative plans. Rather, Eastern Sentry complements them by giving NATO a defensive shield, while Ukraine acts as the offensive proxy. How effective Ukraine's actions and NATO's deterrent defensive power will be remain to be seen. The answers there, however, will dictate whether my next book is about World War III, or whether the Ukraine war wraps up with a nice little bow. Meanwhile, you can tie a nice little bow on one of these 2 existing books, and give it to a conflict-curious friend. Check the video description for more information.
You